This case has a text message sitting at its center that's only 4 words long. It wasn't sent to a lawyer. It wasn't sent to a reporter, a detective, or anyone carrying a badge. On the 5th of July, a mother sent it to an 18-year-old who had spent the previous afternoon standing beside her son on a barrier island, and she asked him the smallest question she could think to ask. What kind of sunglasses was he wearing? Not a legal strategy, not a formal piece of evidence, just a shape, a brand, a detail small enough to fit inside a text message and specific enough to hand to the men out on the water so they'd know exactly what they were searching for. The reply came a short while later, naming a brand. Ray-Bans, he believed. 2 messages, sent between near strangers who would spend the rest of that summer having every word either of them had written about that day picked apart in public. Nolan Wells had climbed onto a boat headed for Horn Island on the morning of the 4th of July. He never made the return trip. His phone did. By that same evening, his family had it back in their hands, tracked to a friend's house on the mainland. When his mother finally unlocked the screen, she found 2 Snapchat accounts that had documented her son's ordinary days for years. On the single day that would end up mattering more than all the rest combined, both accounts were empty. Sit with that for a second. Imagine being handed your child's phone by the very people who were standing next to him when he disappeared, and finding nothing on it. Imagine an independent autopsy that can't commit to a cause of death. Not an accident, not anything else. Just a blank space where a family was owed an answer. Imagine being told, weeks later, that the state has completed its own full autopsy, and that you are not permitted to read one line of it, not even you, his parent. And imagine asking, calmly, for the one phone at the center of it all to be opened properly, with investigators from both sides in the room watching it happen, only to learn that a share of the internet has already decided that being careful is the same thing as being guilty. Chances are you've already seen pieces of this case scroll past. It's been circulating for 7 weeks now, which is more than enough time for a story to stop feeling urgent and start feeling like background noise between videos about something else entirely. Hold on to that feeling, because it says something true about how cases like this one tend to disappear. They rarely vanish because a verdict comes down or an arrest gets made. They vanish because the audience gets tired first. That's usually around the point the news vans pull back onto the highway. The hashtag goes quiet. And somewhere on the Mississippi coast, a family is still sitting with a sealed file and a piece of evidence that nobody with the authority to open it has bothered to touch. For a lot of cases, that's the exact moment public attention starts to fade, right before anything actually gets resolved, not after. So this video is going to do something a little different. Instead of retracing the whole island timeline again, argument by argument, we're narrowing in on one piece of evidence, the phone that made the trip home without him, and following it forward, all the way to a letter written about it just 4 days ago, to understand exactly why it still hasn't been opened. Before we get into it, if you're watching this from somewhere far from the Mississippi coast, drop a comment and tell us where. Cases like this one have a way of traveling further than you'd expect. And if measured, evidence-first true crime documentaries are what you come here for. This is a good moment to subscribe, because there's a lot more to this particular case than one video can hold. Here's the ground both sides in this case actually agree on, before anything else. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, and a young man from Ocean Springs with a football season still ahead of him. On the 4th of July, he traveled out to Horn Island, a barrier island off the Mississippi coast, on a boat trip with 3 friends, described in Reuters reporting as white. He was reported missing that same night. On the morning of July the 6th, a park ranger found him in the water, near the shoreline of the same island he had never actually left. On August the 19th, Nolan Wells should have turned 19. There was no birthday that day. His family asked the country to pray instead. And somewhere in the quiet stretch between a body being recovered and a birthday that never came, the state of Mississippi finished its own autopsy and told no one, not his parents, not the public, what it contains. Which brings us to the number that sits underneath this entire case, heavier than any leaked message or any theory currently making the rounds online. The one piece of evidence both the family and the friends who were on that trip have agreed, in writing, should be examined. Nolan's phone has been sitting untouched, within easy reach, for 48 days. That kind of silence doesn't usually stay unnoticed forever. And the people who eventually broke it were not who most of the internet was expecting. On Monday, the 17th of August, the NAACP's Office of General Counsel announced it was joining the legal team representing Nolan Wells' family. That kind of announcement doesn't happen because a story is trending well online. An organization with that much history and that much to protect doesn't put its name on a case unless someone inside the building has actually read the public record and didn't like what they found there. The person who made that call was Kristen Clark. Before she took the role of NAACP General Counsel, she ran the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, serving as Assistant Attorney General. For years, deciding which cases the federal government would pursue and which ones it would let go was essentially her job. That's what makes this particular announcement different from a sympathetic press release issued from a distance. This is a former federal prosecutor, someone with genuine subpoena instincts, stepping directly into a county-level death investigation and standing beside attorney Ben Crump. In her own words, Clark described the move as taking up the fight for truth and transparency around how Nolan Wells died, promising that the NAACP would bring its own investigative resources to the case and work to make sure no stone was left unturned in the search for answers and accountability on the family's behalf. Notice the word she reached for, not justice, answers. Even the attorneys walking through the door are being careful about what they don't yet know. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson was less careful with his phrasing. He said plainly that the world is watching, and that the Wells family is owed a thorough accounting of what happened to their son. He went further than that, pointing to a pattern he said shows up again and again, that the deaths of young black people, in his words, are too often dismissed, downplayed, or investigated only halfway, unless somebody forces the issue by demanding answers. Here's where the discipline matters more in this case than in almost anything else you'll watch this year. The NAACP stepping in does not establish that foul play occurred. It doesn't confirm that anyone on that boat trip gave inaccurate information. It doesn't mean there's evidence sitting in a locker somewhere, waiting to be unsealed. No one, not a single person, has been charged with any crime connected to Nolan Wells' death. What the announcement actually establishes is narrower than that, and colder. A second institution, with its own attorneys, its own investigators, and its own reputation on the line, looked at everything currently on the public record and concluded that the level of scrutiny this case has received so far isn't enough. And they didn't arrive at that conclusion by staring at the island. They arrived at it by looking at everything that happened in the weeks afterward. The NAACP wasn't even the first outside institution to look at the pace of this investigation and decide something about it felt wrong. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus had already sent a formal letter to the Department of Justice requesting a federal review of Nolan Wells' death. Sitting members of Congress don't ask the Justice Department to look over a county's shoulder as a courtesy. Putting that request in writing, on official letterhead, is its own kind of statement, that they aren't confident the existing process will get to the truth on its own. Measure the distance this case has traveled. On the night of the 4th of July, this was nothing more than a missing person report, filed with the sheriff's office in Jackson County. A teenager hadn't come back from a boat trip, and someone made one phone call to the Coast Guard. 7 weeks later, it involves the oldest civil rights organization in the country, a former federal civil rights prosecutor, a private legal team running its own parallel investigation, and a formal request from Congress asking the Department of Justice to step in. Be honest about what that kind of escalation actually proves, because it isn't what a lot of channels covering this case are telling you. That trajectory is not evidence that a crime occurred. Cases don't accumulate that kind of institutional weight because guilt has already been established. They accumulate it because public confidence has broken down, because a family stopped believing the answers were coming, said so out loud, and enough people with real institutional power looked at the record and decided the family had a point. The central question of this case has quietly shifted. It's no longer only about what happened out on that island. It's about why, 7 weeks later, 3 completely separate institutions have all concluded that nobody has properly established what happened out on that island. And every one of those institutions, when you trace their concerns back far enough, keeps arriving at the exact same object. Go back to the night of the 4th of July, before any of the lawyers, before the press conferences, before this case had a name outside of Jackson County. Nolan hadn't come back. Nobody knew where he was. And somewhere in that family, someone opened a phone locator app. What it showed wasn't a phone lost somewhere in the Mississippi Sound. It showed a phone sitting inside a house on the mainland, the home of one of the young men who had been on the boat with him that day. They drove over. They picked it up. All of it happened that same evening, hours before a search had properly gotten underway. Sit with the sequence for a second, because it's one of the most important details in this entire case, and it gets repeated so often in comment sections and other videos that people have mostly stopped actually hearing it. Nolan didn't come home. His phone did. It made the return trip across that water without him, and it was sitting inside a friend's house before searchers had even properly started looking. Nolan's mother, Christine Wansley, went through the phone with her sister that night. On the 10th of July, she described what she found in an interview with Michael Strahan on Good Morning America. Nolan had kept 2 Snapchat accounts. Both of them were completely empty. What stopped her wasn't just the emptiness, it was the timing. Snapchat typically holds on to photos and videos for roughly 24 hours before they clear automatically. Nolan had spent the 4th of July at an all-day gathering out on the island. That window hadn't even closed yet. There should have been something there. There was nothing at all. By his mother's own description, this was a teenager who filmed everything, who documented practically every ordinary hour on those same 2 accounts, going back years. And on the one day that would end up mattering most, the record simply stopped. She also told Strahan that the location history on the phone didn't line up with what his friends had been showing through their own Snapchat stories from that day. Now, the counterweight to all of that, and it isn't a small one, the friends who were on that trip with Nolan have publicly and repeatedly rejected any suggestion that anything was ever deleted from his phone. They've said so directly, more than once. None of them has been charged with any offense connected to his death, and no investigator or forensic authority has confirmed that any data was actually removed by anyone. What that leaves behind is exactly 3 things: an allegation, a denial, and a single locked device sitting somewhere between the two. In July, Ben Crump said he planned to bring in his own expert to determine whether whatever went missing from that phone could still be recovered, either from the device itself or from Snapchat's own servers, where deleted material doesn't necessarily disappear the moment it's cleared from a user's screen. Weeks later, that expert still hasn't been given the chance to open it, and the actual, publicly documented reason why is considerably more complicated than the version that's been circulating on your feed for the last month. In the middle of August, a set of private text messages started circulating publicly. Messages sent between Christine Wansley and Warren Hudson, one of the young men who'd been on that trip, in the first hours after Nolan went missing. Before we get into a single word of what's actually in them, it matters how they reached you in the first place. No investigator leaked these. Nobody obtained them through a records request. No authority has verified them. They entered circulation through the side of this case they happened to help, presented on a commentary channel as evidence its host believed supported that side's account. That doesn't make the messages false. It makes them curated. What you're reading is the portion of a private conversation that somebody chose to show you, starting exactly where they chose to start it and stopping exactly where they chose to stop. Nobody has confirmed the full exchange is even complete. Keep that in mind. Then, look at what's actually there. The first thing the messages establish isn't really in dispute at all. Warren Hudson reached out to Nolan's mother late on the night of the 4th of July to tell her Nolan was missing. That much is confirmed by mainstream reporting that has nothing to do with this leak. He asked whether he should call the Coast Guard. He made the call. Christine asked him where the vehicles were parked, where the group had launched from. He answered each question. He sent her the launch location. Then she asked him the one question that matters more than any other in this entire case. When was the last time he'd actually seen her son? His answer, sent that same night, before a single lawyer had spoken to anyone, before any press conference existed, before there was a narrative left to protect. 3 in the afternoon, the west tip, the north side of Horn Island. That figure holds up. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office has since publicly stated that Nolan was last seen near the island at around 3 p.m. A frightened 18-year-old, texting a missing boy's mother at midnight, gave the exact same time the sheriff's office would later give the public. Consistency produced in the moment, before anyone knew what answer they'd eventually need, tends to carry more weight than a polished interview given 7 weeks later. Now here's what these messages don't establish, and it's exactly where the commentary built around them starts to fall apart. They say nothing about the window that actually matters. The boat left Horn Island at roughly 4:30 that afternoon. Nolan went into the water sometime after that. Every message in this entire exchange was sent hours later, from the mainland, after the search was already underway. A young man reaching out to a grieving family at 11 o'clock at night isn't evidence about 5 o'clock that afternoon. It isn't proof of guilt. It isn't proof of innocence either. It's evidence about 11 o'clock at night, and nothing more than that. Reaching out to a family doesn't, on its own, establish guilt or innocence in either direction. Treating these texts as some kind of verdict asks you to accept behavior as an alibi, and behavior isn't an alibi. But buried inside that same exchange, mentioned once, skimmed past on air as a throwaway line, is a detail nobody on that broadcast actually stopped to sit with. Hudson told Christine, that same night, that he had Nolan's phone and his keys. The phone that would turn up hours later inside a house on the mainland. The phone that made the trip home without him. The phone 2 Snapchat accounts had been emptied from. The same phone that, weeks later, would become the subject of a dispute between 2 lawyers, neither of whom has backed down. The timeline everybody keeps arguing over sits on a foundation almost nobody has actually examined. Start with what's solid. GPS data from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, obtained by CBS News, shows a boat leaving Horn Island at approximately 4:31 that afternoon. That's not a witness's memory. That's a machine logging a position, with no stake in how the story ends. And the departure wasn't a routine one. Audio from the private towing service confirms the group reported their boat was taking on water, with a bilge pump that had failed. They didn't simply decide to head home early. They called for help and were towed back to the mainland. So the record shows one vessel, in mechanical trouble, leaving the island at a fixed time, under tow, without Nolan Wells on board, which raises a question that sounds like paperwork and is anything but. Which vessel, exactly? In the text messages now circulating, Warren Hudson tells Christine that Nolan had gone out on a 22-foot Triton offshore boat. He says he himself had been on a 24-foot tide line, and that the 2 of them had actually ridden out to the island on separate boats. 2 different manufacturers, 2 different hulls, 2 different boats, both named in a single exchange sent the very night Nolan went missing. Then, on a Nancy Grace broadcast, a guest raised something else entirely, a claim that the Marine Resources report actually lists the vessel that was searched not as a tide line, but as a tide craft. A different company, a different boat. Be clear about what that claim actually is. It hasn't been confirmed by any official source. It was raised on a television panel, sourced to social media, and this channel isn't going to tell you it's true. But the underlying question doesn't disappear just because that one claim is unverified, and here's why it matters so much. A boat isn't a minor detail in a case like this one. It's the container that holds nearly every other fact. The GPS plotter that logged the departure time sits on one specific vessel. The people who gave interviews were on specific vessels. The search itself, when it finally happened, was conducted from a specific vessel. If the identification of those boats hasn't been kept consistent across every account given so far, then every timeline built on top of them inherits that same uncertainty. A GPS track pulled from the wrong hull isn't evidence at all. It's simply a different boat's afternoon. So the question is a simple one, and no authority has answered it publicly yet. How many vessels actually made that trip? Who was on each one? And is the boat named in the official report the same boat these young men have been describing for 7 weeks? Nobody with the power to answer that has done so, and in the gap where that answer should have been, something else started to grow instead. A toxicology report for Nolan Wells has been circulating online for weeks now. People have quoted numbers from it. Channels have built entire videos around it. Comment sections have argued over what it supposedly shows. Officials have confirmed it's fraudulent. No official toxicology result has been released in this case, by anyone, to anyone, at any point. A fake medical document about a dead teenager was manufactured, put online, and traveled far enough that authorities had to publicly denounce it by name. That wasn't the only thing manufactured. Videos of Nolan have surfaced online that were generated using artificial intelligence. Footage portraying a teenager who died in July as though he were still moving and speaking on screen, pushed out to an audience that couldn't always tell it apart from something real. At that point, this stopped being simply content. 3 separate people have now been federally charged in 3 separate cases over alleged threats connected to this investigation. Edward James Porter, from Illinois, is accused of sending threatening messages through Facebook to Warren Hudson's mother, messages that investigators say included photographs of her own children. Michelle Francine Edwards, from Cincinnati, Ohio, is accused of phoning in threats aimed at 2 different Mississippi government offices in the days after Nolan's death. Joseph Alfredo Vasquez Dumars, from California, is accused of making a threat against a Chancery Court judge. Illinois, Ohio, California. None of them appears to have any actual connection to Nolan Wells. None of them knew his family. None of them was anywhere near that island. They watched this case unfold on their phones from 3 different corners of the country, and each of them is now accused of directing threats at people connected to it. The Hudson family turned over recordings of some of the calls they'd received to the Sun-Herald. One caller invoked Nolan's name directly while making a threatening statement. Another accused Benjamin Hudson, the father of a young man who has not been charged with anything, of serious wrongdoing. Nobody in that family has been charged with any offense. Sheriff John Ledbetter eventually had to issue a public statement asking people to simply stop spreading unverified information about the investigation into Nolan's death. Here's how fast a single claim can move in this case, tracked from beginning to end across 72 hours. On the 10th of July, Ben Crump held a press conference referencing a video filmed from a boat near the island, one where a young man's voice can be heard demanding his phone back. Crump said his legal team believed that voice belonged to Nolan. Within hours, that detail was everywhere. The argument over a phone, a confrontation, treated online as Nolan's final words. On the 13th of July, 3 days later, a young man named Tristan Shepard went to ABC News and said the voice on that recording was actually his own. He described standing waist-deep in the water, in the middle of a disagreement with his girlfriend, being criticized by an acquaintance who happened to walk past, and that exchange escalating into a physical confrontation. Nolan, he said, was not the one shouting. 3 days is the entire gap between a claim entering the world and the person actually in the recording stepping forward to identify himself. The original claim is still circulating. The correction barely made a ripple by comparison. And nearly every unverified fragment of this case since has followed that same pattern, because the space it moves through has never once been filled by anyone with real authority. Which brings this story back to the one piece of evidence capable of settling a meaningful share of that speculation on its own, and to the reason, still unresolved as of this week, that it hasn't been opened. This is where we come back to the one piece of evidence capable of resolving a meaningful share of everything you just heard. In the middle of July, both sides in this case agreed to a joint forensic examination of Nolan's phone. Read that again because it matters. Agreed. The family wanted it. The district attorney's office wanted it. The attorney representing the friends who were on that boat wanted it. There is no side in this case actually arguing the phone should stay closed. And yet, as of the 21st of August, it still hasn't been examined. Over the past 2 weeks, the 2 attorneys sitting closest to that delay have put statements on the record that simply cannot both be true. Tyler Cox represents 3 of Nolan's friends. In an interview with Dan Abrams on SiriusXM, Cox said plainly that he has reason to believe, and does believe, that the Wells family has not cooperated with law enforcement. He said he doesn't believe they've actually turned over Nolan's phone at all, the attorney representing the young men from that trip, publicly disputing the family's own account of what happened to it. Ahmad Smith represents the Wells family. On the 17th of August, he wrote directly to Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath. His letter states, in essence, the opposite of Cox's account, that to whatever extent anyone has suggested the family has been unwilling or failed to cooperate with the investigation, that simply isn't the case. It states that the family and their legal team are actively running their own independent investigation, while remaining cooperative with the district attorney's office, and that Nolan's phone has, in fact, been made available for examination by forensic experts from both sides. Then, the letter addresses the delay head-on. According to the family's attorneys, Nolan's parents happened to be out of state on the day the examination was originally scheduled, and beyond that, the 2 sides had never actually finalized a forensic protocol, the written rules that would govern how the device gets handled, how chain of custody is maintained, how any extracted data is preserved, who gets access to what comes off the phone, and when it finally gets returned to the family. Smith closes his letter by simply asking the district attorney to confirm whether the examination will still take place at the location both sides had already agreed on, a community college. A grieving family's attorney, reduced to asking a prosecutor to confirm a room. Two named attorneys, two positions, both on the public record. One says the phone was never actually handed over. The other says it's been available the entire time, and that the real holdup is paperwork governing how it eventually gets opened. Those two accounts flatly conflict with each other, and this isn't going to pretend to know which one is inaccurate, because the public evidence available right now simply doesn't allow for that determination. What can be said is what sits in the space between those two letters. 48 days, one locked device, two Snapchat accounts a mother says were completely empty when she opened them, against a group of friends who say nothing was ever deleted from either one. A question with a factual answer that a competent examiner could likely settle in a single afternoon, and one that has now outlasted the news cycle, the trending hashtag, and a boy's 19th birthday. There's one more document in this case that almost nobody has actually been allowed to read. On the 22nd of July, at the NAACP's National Convention in Chicago, Ben Crump stood beside Elmore and Christine Wansley and announced the results of the autopsy the family had paid for independently. Cause of death, undetermined. Manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. That's the answer a family receives when the available medical evidence simply can't close the question. It doesn't say accident. It doesn't say drowning. It doesn't say homicide. It didn't land on any definitive explanation at all, which means every possibility technically stayed open. But that report carried something else along with it: limitations. The independent examiner noted the constraints he'd actually been working under. According to TMZ, by the time Nolan's remains were released for that second examination, certain anatomical material, along with the original autopsy photographs, were not made available to the independent pathologist. On its own, that kind of retention during a state autopsy doesn't establish anything improper happened. But the limitations still mattered, because the entire purpose of the second examination was to help settle exactly what happened. With key pieces of evidence unavailable to him, the second pathologist ultimately landed on the same undetermined finding for both cause and manner. It's entirely possible he had no other option available to him at all. Now, the other report. The state of Mississippi has completed its own autopsy. The full document, gross findings, toxicology, histology, all of it. It exists. It has existed for weeks now, and it is sealed. Nobody outside a small circle has read a single line of it, and nobody will until a grand jury actually reviews the case. On the 18th of August, District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath explained why, and her explanation is worth actually understanding rather than simply resenting. She said she understands the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but that her office isn't taking time simply for time's sake. That every piece of evidence has to be examined, every credible lead followed all the way through, every witness account weighed against everything else that's been gathered. Pressure for answers, she said, doesn't change what the work actually requires. Then she addressed the silence itself directly. Under Mississippi's rules of professional conduct, a prosecutor's hands are legally tied on what can be released during an active investigation. That restraint, she said, isn't an attempt to keep the truth from the public. It exists to protect the integrity of the investigation and the grand jury proceeding that will eventually follow. She committed to bringing that grand jury the complete evidence, a thorough investigation, and a full understanding of the law. Hold the actual shape of that for a second. The one person in the entire state of Mississippi holding the document that could resolve a meaningful share of this speculation is legally forbidden from showing it to anyone at all. Her silence is an obstruction, it's the rule. Which means that for 7 weeks, much of the public conversation around how this boy died has been built out of leaked text messages, television panels, a fraudulent toxicology report, and AI-generated video. Every single one of them filling a gap that the actual investigative process is legally prohibited from filling on its own. That's why the phone matters more than any of it. It's the one piece of evidence in this entire case that isn't sealed, isn't fraudulent, isn't anonymous, and isn't even contested as to whether it exists. Both sides agree it's real. Both sides agree it could be opened as soon as tomorrow. And 48 days after Nolan Wells died, it remains one of the only doors in this whole case that anybody actually still holds a key to. Everything you've heard about this case falls into one of four categories, and most channels covering it won't bother separating them for you, so we will. Confirmed. Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island on the 4th of July. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office states he was last seen near the island around 3 in the afternoon. Marine Resources GPS data, obtained by CBS News, puts the boat's departure at approximately 4:31. His body was recovered on the 6th of July. His family retrieved his phone from a friend's house that same evening, the 4th. The independent autopsy came back undetermined on both cause and manner. The state autopsy is complete and sealed, pending grand jury review. A joint forensic examination was agreed to and still hasn't happened. The NAACP's Office of General Counsel joined the family's legal team on the 17th of August. The Congressional Black Caucus has requested a Department of Justice review. 3 people have been federally charged over alleged threats connected to this case. The toxicology report circulating online is fraudulent, disputed, and claimed by named parties on both sides. That data was deleted from Nolan's phone. His mother says it was. His friends say it wasn't. That the family failed to cooperate. Tyler Cox says so. Ahmad Smith says the exact opposite in writing to the district attorney. That the search vessel was misidentified in the official report, raised on a television panel, never confirmed by any authority. Every one of those has an actual name attached to it, and not one of them has been resolved. Unverified. The additional witnesses, the extra people supposedly on that island, the screenshots, the accounts claiming inside knowledge nobody can trace. This channel isn't going to repeat any of that. Not this week, not next week, not until a named source with something real to lose is willing to put their name on it. 3 people are already facing federal charges because unverified material like that found an audience willing to act on it. And we're not interested in being part of that supply chain. Not established at all. Whether any person committed any offense in connection with Nolan Wells' death. Nobody has been charged. Nobody has been named a suspect by any authority. No cause of death has been publicly determined by the state of Mississippi. Hold all 4 of those categories at once, and you're holding this case honestly. Collapse them into a single pile, and you become part of the reason a sheriff had to go on the record and ask the public to stop. Strip away the attorneys, the letters, the television panels, the fraudulent documents, the generated videos, and the threats left for strangers' families by people who'd never met them. And what's actually underneath all of it is a boy, 18 years old, from Ocean Springs, a wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, with a full season still ahead of him. A son who filmed everything because he was the kind of teenager who assumed there'd always be time to look back on it later. On the 4th of July, he climbed onto a boat with people he trusted and went to an island he had no reason in the world to fear. On the 19th of August, he should have turned 19. There was no birthday. His family asked the country to pray instead. And on the 5th of July, before any lawyer, any press conference, any federal charge, any of this had a name, his mother sat with her phone in her hands and typed 4 words to a boy who'd been standing beside her son the day before. What kind of sunglasses? She's still waiting on an answer to a far bigger question than that one. Not a verdict, not an arrest. An accounting, a complete, public, documented explanation of the circumstances surrounding her son's death, produced by the people whose actual job it is to produce it. That isn't a controversial thing to ask for. It's the minimum. Until that phone is finally opened, until a grand jury sits, and until investigators and the courts actually establish what happened on Horn Island on the 4th of July, this case remains exactly what it's been for 48 days. A family waiting on a single door that everyone agrees could be opened, and that nobody with the authority to open it has yet. Cases like this one don't stay in the light because of outrage. They stay in the light because people keep asking, calmly and specifically, for answers that can actually be verified. And right now, that's still the only thing this case is asking of anyone watching.